Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
UKIP, or the UK Independence Party, is the most significant new party for a generation. It stands opposite our three Goliath parties, each of which can trace their roots back over a century. And it operates in a system that stacks the deck against new challenger parties. But despite those obstacles, UKIP is currently winning over more than 1 in 10 voters, and it's likely to attract over 1 in 4 at the European elections in May. They've pushed themselves to the front of our political debate. And to find a challenger as significant, you probably want to go back to the Social Democratic Party or the SDP in the early 1980s. But of course that comparison is not really fair, because the SDP was established by 4 Labour politicians who already had access to the corridors of power. That was a revolt from above. UKIP's is very much a revolt from below among specific social groups. And as I'll try and convince you over the next 30 minutes, this revolt really does matter. And unfortunately, it's also a revolt that is completely misunderstood. Now, if you looked at the wider debate in Britain, you'd actually think that we had a pretty good grasp of what's going on. The sudden arrival of this new party, we're repeatedly told, is merely a reflection of enduring divisions within the Conservative Party over Britain's EU membership. UKIP is a second home for middle-class Conservatives who live out in the shires and between rounds of golf spend their time complaining about the costs of the EU and longing for the days when Margaret Thatcher handbagged the Eurocrats. To top it off, now these Conservatives have David Cameron as their leader, a so-called Conservative who does not share their passion for withdrawing from Britain, but instead has thrown himself into supporting equal marriage and climate change. Now, this conventional wisdom that frames UKIP as merely a Conservative splinter group is understandable. That is where UKIP came from in 1993 as an anti-EU single-issue pressure group. But this image of UKIP as merely a collection of Conservatives in exile is actually now so well entrenched that even progressive social democrats are cheering on the rise of UKIP, confident that it is a useful tool that they can use to undermine the right. But the thing about conventional wisdoms is that they are often wrong. And the thing about political parties is that they often change. This revolt on the right is far more complex than we think, and its roots can be traced back over decades. This story, at least in very broad terms, starts here, with the decline of several groups in British society that we loosely term the left behind. Financially insecure, anxious Britons in blue-collar jobs who sought protection in trade unions, relied on the state for council housing, who had no educational qualifications because they left school at the earliest opportunity. Now, in the era that this chart takes us back to, Harold Wilson and the swinging 60s, these left-behind groups dominated society. And as a consequence, they were large enough to dominate the minds of our political parties and politicians who ignored them at their peril. But since then, and in only 50 years, their numbers have dwindled. Now, if we flip this coin, we can see how the decline of the left behind has been mirrored by the rise of very different groups in our society. The more financially secure, professional, university-educated, middle-class voters. And it is these graduates, homeowners, and more prosperous voters who now dominate, and as a consequence, have found themselves the subject of campaigns at election time. So in only 50 years, and I'm painting some very broad strokes here, Britain has been transformed from a society where low-skilled, low-educated, blue-collar voters decided elections to one where these left-behind groups have arguably now just become spectators in battles for the professional middle-class vote. This broad social change really matters, not just because it has transformed Britain's economic structure, but because it has changed the values that guide our society. Put simply, those who were left behind by Britain's economic transformation since the 1970s, who were then hit the hardest by the financial crisis and austerity, hold a very different outlook to those with the skills and resources to adapt and compete in the global economy. And importantly for this talk, this divide in values is especially striking when we look at the core radical right offer to voters on issues like Europe, national identity, immigration, and attitudes towards our politics. And as I will show you, this debate that has opened up has also grown since the financial crisis. So let's take a look at these divisions. First, let's look at our attitudes towards whether Britain should leave the European Union, which is the core founding issue for UKIP. Now, since the mid-1990s, the Left Behind groups have been around 2 or 3 times as likely as the university-educated middle class to say, I agree, Britain should withdraw from the European Union. But as you can see, this divide has also grown since the crisis. At the top are those low-skilled workers in Britain who were never sold on the idea of European integration, and the crisis has just intensified that opposition. In sharp contrast, at the bottom, those professional, university-educated, middle-class voters, they've become more sceptical since the crisis, but actually large majorities continue to hold positive views of Europe, and if they don't, chances are they can be persuaded to accept our membership. Now, the differences do not stop there. If I were to show you how these attitudes change across generations, then we would see a similarly sharp divide. Those older Britons who were born before Britain joined the European Union are the most likely to say, yeah, we should leave the EU. But those born after 1975, far more positive in their attitudes. And this divide extends also to how we see immigration, currently the second most important issue for voters. The Left Behind groups, again, have a very different outlook. This chart is showing you the number of voters, or the percentage of voters, who spontaneously mention immigration as one of the most important problems facing Britain. And you can see, again, a sharp and clear divide across these two very broad groups. At the top, those older, blue-collar, less well-educated, left-behind voters, and at the bottom, those from the middle class who went to university and who were born since 1970. And of course, you might notice 2 other things about this chart. Look at when concern over immigration peaks, before the collapse of the Lehman Brothers and before the financial crisis. But also, look at how those concerns are sharpening now as the crisis subsides. Among secure and privileged groups, the issue of immigration has not returned to the forefront of their minds to the same extent as this issue has returned to the minds of the Left Behind groups in Britain. But perhaps most important of all is how these divisions also extend to how we see our politics. The working class and low-skilled, the Left Behind, are actually twice as likely as middle-class professionals and graduates to say, we have no say in government, a ratio that has held broadly steady for about 25 years. But here we find something new. If you look at what's happened since 2010, those at the top, these Left Behind groups, feel more alienated from our politics than ever before. Those with the skills and the resources to compete, they are concerned to a certain extent, but it is not as sharp as those in the more disadvantaged groups. Just consider this. 40% of working class Britons today strongly agree that they have no say in government. The equivalent figure among those better off groups is 16%. This is not just a reflection of social change, obviously. This is also about the strategies that have been pursued by our political institutions and the extent to which they are representative. In Parliament today, only 4% of our MPs have experience of manual work. Okay, so there are bigger issues at play here, obviously, but I'm not going to dwell on those. Instead, I want to emphasise the point that UKIP, before they even turned up to the party of British politics, they had a reservoir of potential supporters ready and waiting. The only difference, of course, is that unlike our European neighbours, for example, France, Austria, Italy, and Denmark, until UKIP, we simply didn't have an articulate and effective vehicle that could mobilise these concerns into our politics. So this is a sort of broad background and the social changes that underpin this. Our data on who is actually supporting UKIP today, and we asked almost 6,000 of them. And we looked at their views across a 10-year period from 2004 until 2014. And this chart is showing you the results from something called logistic regression analysis, which basically is showing you the relative probability of supporting a party while controlling for the different sizes of the parties. And the take-home point for you here is that UKIP's revolt is the most socially distinctive revolt in British politics. UKIP's base of support is more distinct than the support for any other political party in Britain. Those who say that this is some kind of catch-all protest movement where Nigel Farage is bringing people in from across society are way off the mark. Those who say that this is about middle-class Conservatives are way off the mark. This revolt is heavily working class. In fact, UKIP is the most working class dominated party in British politics since Michael Foot led the Labour Party in the early 1980s. This is not unique to Britain. In other European states, France, Austria and Italy, for example, radical right parties have made sweeping incursions into red territory, winning over working class voters through a combination of economic protectionism and opposition to immigration. But if you look at UKIP's base, it's also low educated. Over half of UKIP's voters left school at 16 or earlier. There's a clear gender gap towards men. I think we can probably explain that. And it's also an older electorate. Almost 60% of Nigel Farage's voters are over the age of 54. Only 1 in 10 are under the age of 35. So while this radical right revolt in Britain is a late starter, if we put it in a European context, it arrived some 20 years after similar revolts in other states. Since 2010, UKIP has attracted a very distinct group of voters who share a very sharp profile. Old, blue-collar, left-behind voters who dropped out of school, have few skills, and hold a fundamentally different outlook than that which guides the new middle-class majority that controls our politics and our media. And you can also understand UKIP's appeal by understanding its weaknesses. The groups that Nigel Farage and UKIP are weakest among: ethnic minorities, young Britons, university graduates, and to a lesser extent women. These are the groups that UKIP will need to build a national political force. At the moment, they are not turning to UKIP to the same extent as these groups. So what do they think? Well, just keep your eyes fixed on the purple columns. This is showing you the attitudes of supporters of different parties towards 4 key motives that are often associated with the radical right. Almost 3/4 of UKIP voters give immigration the highest possible rating as an important issue. Almost 2/3 of them say they are strongly Eurosceptic. In fact, when we asked this another way, we found that 95% of UKIP's voters disapprove of Britain's EU membership, which perhaps is not surprising, but I do wonder what the other 5% are doing in UKIP. They're also very politically dissatisfied. Almost half of them say they're dissatisfied with the state of our national democracy, and almost 1 in 3 on the end there feel very pessimistic about their economic prospects. But actually, you know, while they are strongly Eurosceptic, when we run the analysis, which is in far more detail in the book, we find that Euroscepticism by itself is not enough to bring these voters to Nigel Farage. Think of him as a car salesman. He needs the customer to be Eurosceptic when they walk into the car showroom. But he also needs them to hold one of 2 other motives if he's going to lock them down and make a sale. They need to either be very anxious about immigration, or, preferably both, very dissatisfied with our politics and the perceived unresponsiveness of our political elites. This is an intensely motivated electorate, angry, fed up, ready for a radical alternative. So what began in 1993 and continues to shape our response to UKIP even today as a single-issue anti-EU rebellion, mainly among ex-Conservatives, has quickly grown into a potent force, consolidating those left-behind voters, those trends that we saw beginning in the 1970s, and winning over Britons who are in essence saying no 3 times. No to Brussels, no to the political elites in Westminster, no to immigration. And they're turning to UKIP because they feel very alienated. They feel cut out of our political conversation, not just by David Cameron. This is showing you how important dissatisfaction with our political leaders is in driving UKIP support after we control for all other factors. Dissatisfaction with mainstream party leaders. The take-home point towards the end over the last 2 years, dissatisfaction with Labour, with Ed Miliband, is almost as important as dissatisfaction with David Cameron in driving support for this new political party, which raises an interesting question in itself. Where are these voters coming from politically? We already know where they're coming from socially. Where are they coming from politically? Are they just disillusioned ex-Conservatives? Well, right now, those ex-Conservatives are a big source of support for UKIP. But it wasn't always the case. UKIP thrives under very different political contexts. Before 2010, we can see how UKIP voters were almost as likely, sometimes more likely, to say at the last election, I supported Labour. In fact, UKIP more generally, and this political revolt that it is leading, raises as many questions for Labour as it does the Conservatives, just as the rise of Marine Le Pen in France or Christian Strache in Austria raises big questions for Social Democrats across the Channel. This revolt on the right should trouble the left, because at a time of falling incomes, rising inequality, enduring insecurities, the left-behind groups are not moving behind Ed Miliband, the traditional defender and a party that traditionally spoke for people concerned over redistribution and equality. Instead, they're choosing a party and a leader who's broadly at ease with globalization and the free markets, calls itself libertarian, wants to cut welfare, and at the last election promised to abolish inheritance tax. There's an irony in this space that we need to understand and we need to explain. Why are these blue-collar voters shifting behind a former stockbroker and not Ed Miliband? And we can see this challenge more clearly by looking at how UKIP have grown since 2010. Why are we hearing so much about UKIP? Why are they doing so well in these parliamentary by-elections? Why are they doing so well locally? This chart shows you the groups among which all of our parties have grown or been knocked back since 2009. And it shows you that among those groups where UKIP are weakest, professionals and managers, university graduates, women, the under-35s, minorities, and the overall mean, that actually Labour are doing much better than UKIP. Right? Ed Miliband is winning over these groups. But let's now look at those left-behind groups. Now, among core UKIP groups, Labour support has risen by only 3 percentage points. Across the left-behind, UKIP are now pushing ahead of the political party that was traditionally associated with supporting the most vulnerable in our society. Working class, left school at 16, men, the over 65s. UKIP are doing far better than Labour since 2009 among these groups. And of course, another reason that this really does matter for the left is because these left-behind groups tend to be very concentrated geographically. Let's take a look at the top 100 UKIP-friendly seats in the country. And all we've done is looked at the local demographic conditions. Which types of areas do you find lots of potential UKIP voters? The top 20, going right up to 100, it is no surprise, given what we've discussed until now, that actually the types of areas that we find are most receptive to the radical right in Britain, like the types of areas that are most receptive to the radical right in other European states, are actually held by Labour. What we are not saying is that UKIP will necessarily do very well in these seats. What we are saying is that in these seats there are lots of left-behind voters who hold the exact social and attitudinal profile that we would expect to make them very receptive to Nigel Farage and his anti-establishment, anti-immigration message. Whether UKIP actively work and target these kinds of areas is another thing altogether. Now, clearly all of this hints at a bigger problem facing not just Labour but our political system. When we track the proportion of left-behind voters who say they identify with the two main parties over the past 30 years, what do we find? This chart is showing you the percentages of working class voters and those with no qualifications and the extent to which they've supported Labour or the Conservatives. In the 1980s and the 1990s, working class voters, these groups with no qualifications, were more or less locked into our party system. They either voted for the Conservatives or they voted for Labour, or, mainly they voted for Labour. But during the 2000s, these left-behind groups steadily lost faith in Labour. Instead of attaching themselves to the Conservatives, however, they simply stopped identifying with any of our mainstream political parties. This is a big problem for Labour, because these voters right now should be rushing back to Ed Miliband and helping them get into power in 2015. It's also a problem right now for the Conservatives, because these left-behind groups are flocking to a party that has a real chance of inflicting some big damage on their marginal seats over the next couple of years. UKIP, then, is not a second home for disgruntled Conservatives. It is becoming a first home for angry and disaffected left-behind groups in our society from all political backgrounds who are rapidly losing faith in a political system that arguably ceased to represent them long ago. The outlook of the average left-behind voter who is now turning to UKIP is strikingly different to that held by the younger, university-educated, cosmopolitan, London-focused, middle-class professionals who now dominate our politics and our media. Unlike many of us, these voters see a cosmopolitan, multicultural, global Britain as an alien and fundamentally threatening place. Arguably, it's a country they neither recognise nor one they necessarily want to be a part of. They feel powerless to stop these changes from happening, and they feel intensely angry at all of our political elites for either not seeming to understand or even caring about what is being lost. In this sense, don't think of Nigel Farage and UKIP as a political party. They're not actually that interesting as a political party in terms of organisation. Think of them as a symptom of deep and growing social and value divisions in Britain. UKIP matter not because of what they would do in 2015. They matter because they are bringing these divides that have been building up for decades back into the political mainstream, even without a coherent ideology or a worldview. There is no Farageism. They are articulating and responding to these deep-seated, long-standing conflicts. So if we're going to understand this, we need to move away from day-to-day conflicts and the rumours and the gossiping of the Westminster Village, and we need to begin to think far more seriously about how we heal these deeper and longer-term conflicts. Put it this way, trying to explain UKIP in terms of Cameron's position on the European Union, in my view, is as futile or misleading as trying to explain the rise of Labour in the early 20th century by pointing towards the Liberals' policy on trade and tax. Writing about that earlier insurgency by the SDP in the 1980s, two academics, Ivor Crewe and Anthony King, noted that the SDP had borne a resemblance to a biography of someone who had shown much promise but died young. It's too early to know whether UKIP will follow that same path into the electoral wilderness like so many challengers before. But in a sense, it doesn't really matter. Irrespective of what happens to UKIP, they have opened a window on particular groups in our society who feel left behind and cut out of modern Britain.